Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for being in the audience today. I know it takes some effort to make it to Pioneer Square this early in the morning and even just to find parking, so I really appreciate your presence. I'm also excited not just to talk to you, but to talk with you, so I'm looking forward to the small group discussions and the Q&A at the end of this talk. When David first reached out to me about this topic, about courage, I was really excited. This is a theme that is of personal significance to me, and it's also one of my favorite words. But my initial reaction was to think about the experiences of people that I work with. I work with a lot of really courageous people. I didn't necessarily think about my own experiences. But as I talked to friends and colleagues about this event, I learned that a lot of people expected me to talk about a specific aspect of my experience, about that mountain climbing that you heard about at the end. And it turns out a lot of people associate climbing with courage. And so that's not the main bent of my talk today, but that's where I'll start. And I'll first turn it to all of you. How many of you in the audience today are afraid of heights? Okay, not that many. That's good. You will live long lives of not falling off of things. It's a very healthy fear. But I think what's interesting to me is that for many of you, the idea of rock climbing is probably terrifying. Fear of heights will engender that. And especially big mountain climbing, which is the kind of climbing that I do. And by big mountain climbing, I mean crossing glaciers, climbing vertical ice fields with ice axes and crampons, hanging off of rocky spires, and then skiing off of the top of that mountain at a speed that often closely resembles falling off of that top of the mountain with skis. But I often don't fear in those scenarios. I've got a lot of technical expertise and training that allows me to move safely through the mountains. And usually I just feel empowered and fulfilled when I'm standing on the top of a mountain or in a beautiful place. And so the same activities that for me feel joyful might be fearful for some of you. They might require an act of courage, where for me, I don't necessarily associate courage with those acts. And I think that there's an important insight there. Courage and fear are two sides of the same coin. And often to look at a courageous act is to understand the fear that you overcame to do it. And Nelson Mandela has said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And I really believe in that. We tend to think of courageous acts in big ways, like climbing a mountain or running into a burning building, where the fear is really obvious. It's a little bit easier to overlook everyday courage, kind of the simpler activities that require courage. And there's lots of fears that we feel and overcome every day. By little everyday fears, I mean something as simple as putting your kid on the school bus in the morning and wondering if they're going to be bullied that day at school. Or maybe taking on a big project at work that may be a stretch for you, where you don't necessarily know the path forward or know the outcome. And I think it's easy to overlook those fears, because to acknowledge them means to also acknowledge a kind of vulnerability, to recognize something that you're afraid to do or maybe afraid to lose. But if you recognize that vulnerability, if you can name it, it's sometimes easier to ask of yourself or to ask of someone else a courageous act, because you can call out what that is causing the fear. This is something that I think a lot in my work, because the work that I do is behavior change for societal good. I design health and development programs that nudge people to certain behaviors, usually for a healthier outcome or political engagement. I do that work now from Seattle, but as you heard, I used to do that work in war-torn countries, conflict zones like Afghanistan and Sudan. And so a lot of the work that I do is trying to understand the daily patterns that people have, their routines, and potential ways to maybe break some of those patterns down to insert a new behavior. Or a little bit more subtly, to understand the biases that people have and find ways to introduce a new perspective. Sometimes that's really simple. Maybe it's just encouraging someone to go to the doctor for the first time, even if they haven't in a while. They may be afraid of the news that they may receive. Sometimes it's getting somebody to have a difficult political conversation with somebody on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Maybe some of you can relate to having an uncomfortable conversation like that in the last year. To do that, it requires putting people usually into a place of discomfort, into a place of vulnerability. Even if the outcome is a positive one, even if you want that good health care, if you want to hear what the doctor has to say, it requires some vulnerability to get there. And so the work that I do requires tremendous courage from the people that I work with. And I used to approach this work in a very rational, systematic way. If I want to achieve certain behavior, target behavior, say getting someone to show up for a midterm election, where voter turnout is usually a little bit lower, then the easiest way to do that is to understand all of the barriers that is preventing someone from doing that behavior and removing them. So we can do research, we can understand why people don't vote. Maybe it's that there's too long of a line at the voting station. Easy solution, more voting stations, shorter lines. Maybe they're afraid for their physical safety. This is especially true in the developing world where there's often violence around political elections. So that's also a somewhat easy solution. We can put safety monitors in place. We can organize buses to bring people from their communities to a voting station so they can return home safely. Maybe it's difficulty getting time off of work. Again, that's a barrier that we can overcome. We can work with employers to sponsor their staff to leave during the day, or we can mandate time off for elections. But it turns out, with behavior change, that simply removing barriers to an action is rarely enough. That's like saying, you'll be healthier if you exercise more. It doesn't actually work that way. It doesn't usually drive a change in your everyday routine. What that fails to acknowledge is there's usually deeper fears, deeper vulnerabilities that are associated with that action that prevents people from doing the behavior that we want. With an election, that may be a deeper fear of choosing the wrong candidate or not really understanding the issues. Maybe fear of judgment from someone else who doesn't share their political views, from a spouse, from a friend. And so to drive behavior change in those scenarios, we want to first understand the vulnerability, the place from which people are coming, and connect that vulnerability, that fear, to something that is worth experiencing discomfort for. And usually that's a higher aspiration. That's a bigger goal. In the case of a midterm election, it's not usually enough to say, it is your civic duty to vote. That is a key part of democracy. It is important that you show up. Instead, we can connect it to something that you want more, that is really deeply important on a personal level. In the case of politics, a lot of times that's around the future. So we might say to parents, do you want the best teacher for your child at school next year? And most parents would say, yes, of course, obviously. And we connect that deeper value of education, back to the midterm election. So if you want the best teacher for your child, then it's important that schools are fully funded. And to make sure that schools are fully funded, you have to understand that that occurs at the local level. And if you want funding for your schools and the best teacher for your child, you need to show up to vote. So connecting people to something that is worth experiencing discomfort for is usually the way to drive behavior change. Now, I didn't fully appreciate how much courage it took to take action like this until I experienced personal loss myself. And to share that story, I'm going to bring you with me on a journey to another country where I used to live and work, South Sudan, which is the newest country on the planet. It came into existence in 2011 when it succeeded from North Sudan. And it is a very difficult place to live and work. It is in Central Africa in the middle of the Sahel. It is exactly on the equator, so every day there's daylight hours for 12 hours to the minute. It's hot. It stays 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes even at night. In the dry season, in the summer, the sun is so overwhelming that it will bake the earth into this dusty storm, and it's almost impossible to grow crops. And in the winter and the rainy season, communities flood, washes out roads. To travel between towns or villages, you have to either wade through swamps or get in a canoe or a raft to travel. On top of that hard geography, in Sudan, there are myriad numbers of poisonous snakes and spiders. It is home to some of the most dangerous animals in the world. And it has been at conflict for most of the last 50 years. It's a tough place. I was working there in 2010 for an organization that was managing community health projects and civic engagement. The country was on its way to this election where they were going to vote to succeed as a country, become a standalone country, South Sudan. And it was the first election process, presidential election, that would decide the future government of this new country. It was kind of an all-hands-on-deck time. My team was working really hard. The communities in which we were working were overwhelmed. There was a lot of political conflict associated with this election. So a lot of our staff had already evacuated to other countries. And in the midst of this difficult time, I was sick. I had malaria, which is not uncommon in that part of the world, and many of my colleagues had malaria, but I wasn't getting better. Usually with malaria, it's a pretty simple fix. You take 3 pills called ACTs, and you're better in a few days. But I kept relapsing. I got malaria. I'd had 104-degree temperature now for a few weeks. I would take the drugs. I would get sick again. But the work felt really urgent to me, especially this idea of civic engagement, of getting people out to vote in this really important election. So after I relapsed for the 3rd time, I went into our community clinic, one of the clinics that my organization was managing, and I asked for a different drug. I asked for a new form of treatment. And what was recommended to me was a drug called quinine, which is kind of an oldie-timey medicine. It was popular in the 1800s. It's also an ingredient in tonic water, which is what gives it its bitter taste. And that drink became popular also in the 1800s because of its anti-malarial properties. But the quinine, while is very effective against a drug-resistant strain of malaria, which I seem to have, also has slightly more powerful side effects. So in about 20% of cases, patients who take quinine temporarily lose their hearing. And in a small percent of cases, that hearing loss is permanent. You actually go deaf in the process of taking this drug. So I had 2 reactions to this diagnosis. The first was very rational. It was, well, I want to get healthy to continue to do the work. And then the second was a much more vulnerable reaction. Oh my gosh, what if I go deaf? What if I lose my hearing? So I had what may be a less rational reaction. I decided to take the medicine, but I also created a playlist, which I called the Going Deaf playlist, of all of the songs that I would most want to listen to if they were the last things that I ever heard. And it is an amazing playlist. It ranges from piano concertos by Chopin to tabla music by Zakir Hussain. And when I listen to that music now, it's still a wonderful playlist, still some of my favorite songs, but I can hear in that music a sadness, kind of this impending doom that I was feeling of maybe losing my hearing. And I did not lose my hearing, good news. And I was able to get a better form of medication and get healthy. But for the first time, I really understood the fear that a lot of people in the communities where I was working felt when they came into a clinic. The vulnerability that they felt in talking to a doctor where they didn't really understand what the health situation was that they were going through. So I could relate to that vulnerability, and we could design programs that accommodated their behavior and that fear in a much more effective way. That said, I was still able to keep my personal vulnerability and my professional life a little bit separate. In fact, that was necessary, especially working in hard places like Sudan or Afghanistan. I left South Sudan to go to Afghanistan, where I lived for 3 years. And keeping a little bit of a barrier between my personal vulnerabilities and my professional life was really important. I worked mostly with Afghan colleagues, mostly with Afghan men. And as you can imagine, as a Western woman in that environment, I had to keep up a pretty strong barrier between myself and the fear that I might have felt in that scenario, and the people that I worked with. In Afghanistan, I was doing really similar work. Political engagement, trying to help communities take ownership of the future of their country, health work, refugee work. And I was able to keep that kind of professional-personal divide for a while. And then about 1.5 years into my time in Afghanistan, I learned that I had cancer. Cancer at any time is overwhelming, but all of a sudden I found myself managing a really serious disease in the middle of a war zone. Like many people who have that disease, it's a juggling act, but it was compounded for me by the situation in which I was. I was isolated from my friends and community. I was out on the frontiers of the world in this really difficult place. I was visibly sick, so that personal-professional divide shattered. People could see that I was unwell. I was leaving the country pretty regularly to get treatment. I would go to neighboring regions for care. And I found that as I opened up about what I was going through, I connected to people in a way that was entirely unexpected. By sharing my vulnerability, people could connect to me in a new way. And I remember one time in particular, I was talking to a group of colleagues of Afghan men, telling them that I was leaving again for medical vacation to go get care. And one man in particular looked like everything you imagine a terrorist might look like. He had a big turban, long beard, eyeliner under his eyes, which was common in part of the country from which he came. And he had fought with the Mujahideen against the Russians in the 1980s. He looked at me and he asked what ended up being the right question. He asked, "Are you scared?" And it turns out that he had lost his mother to cancer, and that cancer is universally scary, even for an Afghan villager on the other side of the world. And I was scared. And for him, recognizing my vulnerability and then me understanding a little bit more of his and the fact that he had personal experience with this disease too, allowed us to connect in a way that we hadn't before. We were connecting human to human for the first time, across worlds, across cultures, across this gender divide that was so prevalent in Afghanistan. It was really amazing. And I think that opening up about that vulnerability, of being clear about the sickness that I had, allowed me to understand where other people were coming from and the little acts of courage that they manifested every day. So I managed the disease for about a year by going back and forth to other countries. But as it progressed, I learned that I was going to have surgery. And the surgery was scheduled back in the United States. So I was planning to fly there to undergo the surgery, and I had to be awake for the surgery. The doctors recommended coming with a podcast, coming with some music for distraction. And I thought, oh, well, I have the perfect playlist. I've worked on this. I am ready to go. Turns out, though, that the surgery was a lot longer than I realized. It was going to be maybe a 5 or 6 hour surgery. So I only had an hour of music. I was not prepared. I was going to need a deeper cut for this playlist. And so I did something that was incredibly brave for me. I put all of my fears and vulnerabilities on the table, and I wrote to just about everybody that I knew. I wrote to my friends, I wrote to my colleagues, I wrote to people that I hadn't spoken to in a few years, I wrote to people that I kind of wanted to be friends with but wasn't quite there yet. And I told them where I was, what I was going through. I told them about the Going Deaf playlist and that I had created this music at another time of hardship for myself. And I asked for submissions. I asked all of my friends and colleagues, if you had one song to listen to before you go deaf, what would it be? And can you send it to me? I received the most amazing songs. Some of them were poignant. I could hear the other person's soul in that choice. Some of them were funny. They were trying to make me laugh. Some people thought that was way too serious of a prompt, and so they sent me their favorite dance song of the week. That was cool, too. But in listening to the songs that I received back, it was like having that friend there holding my hand for the few minutes of music that I was listening to. It was truly amazing. And I realized with this tremendous outpouring of support that while I had been afraid of the disease, what I was ultimately afraid of was the isolation of the disease, of being alone, of being away from my community and my family, of being so far out there on the edge of the world. And by putting my vulnerability out there, using music as this rallying point for my community, I could get the support and help that I needed. So this is a lesson, well, there's a couple takeaways from that story, I think. And it's a happy ending. I'm healthy. I've been healthy for a few years, so all is well there. But first, if you're ever going through a hard time, might I recommend that you ask your friends for music. You will receive an amazing bouquet of individual songs, and it is such a wonderful experience to connect to people that way. I would even prompt all of you to take a moment and think about the song that you would listen to, or maybe send to a friend if you had just a few moments to decide. We'll maybe come back to that with the small group discussions, so just take a minute and think about what that might be. The second takeaway is going back to designing for specific behaviors. This is something that I think about a lot. So the human-centered design work that I do tries to recognize how people feel vulnerable and then connect them to that higher purpose. And so I think it's important to recognize that courage of any kind requires some form of vulnerability. And you can seek to inspire that courage by acknowledging the vulnerability and by connecting it to something that is worth experiencing discomfort for. In my case, with malaria in South Sudan, it was music. And with cancer in Afghanistan, it was using music to connect to a broader sense of community. So I've got a lot of examples of how I apply this to my work and how I can design for behaviors by connecting to a higher purpose and thinking about exploring people's vulnerabilities. And I'm happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A or give some examples depending on how we're doing for time. But I also want to leave you all with a quote that I use when I am feeling a little bit intimidated by a problem or when I want to take this lesson and put it into practice in my design work. That's a quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He's the author of The Little Prince. And he says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to haul timber, give orders, divide the work. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And I think that that's really key to courage and to understanding vulnerability. You can't tell people to be courageous or expect that of yourself. Instead, you can connect people to an aspiration, to that beautiful vision of the open ocean, to amazing playlist, to music that is personally meaningful. Courage, as I said in the beginning, isn't necessarily the absence of fear. It isn't bravery or stoicism. It's a willingness to expose your vulnerabilities in service of something that you actually want. And you can do that for other people too, by making a meaningful connection. I learned this for myself by going through hardship. And I also learned through that process to recognize it in others. And I hope that some of you may do the same. I can imagine that it's incredibly important in the work that each one of you does to find moments of courage, and those little moments of courage, not the big ones, that allow you to take on new projects, that allow you to manage relationships, to interact with family, with friends. And by being vulnerable and by overcoming those vulnerabilities, you can accomplish a lot more than if you try to keep up that barrier like I did. So I will encourage you all to think about those vulnerabilities and how you can apply it to your everyday work. You can either go to examples, or I would love to talk a little bit more about the music. And I'm looking to David here since I don't have a watch. Okay, all right. So one of the ways that I apply this to my work, and I'll give a specific example here. Recently, I was working on a project around family planning, access to reproductive health services in West Africa. And one of the things that we know around maternal health is that babies and mothers are more likely to survive if pregnancies are spaced at least 18 months apart. It's a very simple health intervention, and it makes sense when you think about it. Over time, women are healthier if they have more time to rest and recover between pregnancies. But in the part of the world where I was working, it has some of the highest birth rates in the world. And we wanted to understand why, in this behavior change work that I do, women continue to have pregnancies without putting space between those births. And it turns out that it's not just about access to contraception or access to medical services. It's about the difficulty of having an uncomfortable conversation with a spouse. It's about the value of being a mother and of manifesting motherhood above all else. And it's about really prioritizing children. So the work that we did was trying to understand what motivated women to continue to have large families and unpacking that process. We were able to connect individuals in those communities with a higher purpose by understanding what was truly driving their health behaviors. In that case, it was, again, education, being able to afford quality education for their children, which meant that they couldn't put 10 to 13 kids through school, which was the average birth rate in these countries. That meant maybe only having 4 to 5 children to be able to afford that quality education process. And there had been many programs in those areas that delivered health services for mothers just from a medical perspective, without really understanding what motivated and drove them. And so by thinking not just about immediate needs, about health outcomes, but about their long-term vision, long-term aspirations, we're able to drive really effective change and influence the behavior, influence those women's willingness to speak to others. And I think that that's a really powerful example because it is a medical case, but connecting it to the long-term vision is what really drove the behavior. I, again, didn't really appreciate how important that was until I had to go through those same clinics myself and realize the frustrations. So coming back to climbing, where many of you may feel fear in situations that isn't reflected in mine, to influence behavior in other people, the key to behavior change is, I apologize, I've lost my transition here. To recognize other people's individual choices allows for a shift in the way that they think about behaviors. I'm so sorry. I'll bring it back to my close. I was going to add another example there, and I lost my train of thought. So if courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over fear, I would love to begin our small group discussions and perhaps have David come up to organize our next group around a way that you are feeling an absence of courage in your daily life, something that you want to change, a pattern of behavior that you may need to shift personally or professionally, and to think about that broader aspiration. Think about the open ocean, think about the powerful music, and use that as a means to motivate both yourself and think about how you can drive behavior change within your organization as an entrepreneur. Thanks. Does anyone want to share an example of a time that they were courageous or a way that they're going to be applying courage to their everyday life? Maybe tell a story that you just heard from someone else? No? No examples? Okay. You're not courageous, I know. Public speaking. I just got all vulnerable up here, you guys. Questions? Yes?
I mean, we're asking for examples. I think one thing that we was saying no with integrity. Especially in a creative realm, like you're saying, client, boss, having to disagree sort of respectfully and sort of meet them where they're at, try to convince them. But often being shot down and sort of going back and taking that risk again and again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually holding ground and saying no instead of yes to something is really challenging. Yes?
Can you share your playlist?
That's a great question, actually. She asked if I could share my playlists. I have not put them on Spotify yet, but I was actually just thinking about doing that. I'm not sure all of the music is on Spotify, but I will look for it and I will post it after this event. The long one especially is quite eclectic, but worthwhile. Other questions? Are there stories that you just heard from each other? Yes?
Do you still have that same professional personal boundary, or is it like kind of more?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was actually talking to people at the beginning of this conversation. The transition back to the US was really hard for me. So I found that I kind of put up that same barrier in the process. I had to reinvent a little bit. I had worked in war zones for most of my adult life. And so when I moved back to the US, that was the first time that I had lived here in a professional capacity as an adult. I think it took a while for me to break down that barrier again. So this has been a story of throwing up that wall. But every time I do expose my vulnerabilities, I find that I get further with work. I get further with my connections to my colleagues. So I wouldn't recommend following my path, but it is something that I've struggled with and finding that right balance. It's a great question. Yes, all the way in the back.
What's your favorite method or process for kind of discovering these vulnerabilities and things that will get uncovered?
Also a great question. The question was, what is your favorite method of uncovering the vulnerabilities or trying to understand those underlying fears that would motivate behavior change? I do a lot of primary research in my work for human-centered design, so that may be focus group work and actually bringing together and having a conversation about issues that they care about. Sometimes it's desk research, but usually it's actually going out and talking to people and pulling out common themes. It's almost never an explicit statement. It's trying to understand the relationships that people have with each other and with a specific behavior that ultimately surfaces those vulnerabilities. So talking to people is the answer.
So I have two things. One is a comment, which is this was fabulous, and thank you for sharing your story. And the third is just our experience. We were crying, and we're just sort of talking about how powerful tears are, and it's a vulnerable thing to cry in this culture. You know, to sort of just let it down and to. But we found our group found that it really connected us in the heart, and like the courage is about from the heart, right?
Yeah.
So it's just I don't know. It was a powerful experience, and you were the catalyst.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, it's amazing how sometimes that physical manifestation, we resist that, right? But that's ultimately what gives an inroad to connect with somebody else. As I talked about in my story, the fact that I was visibly sick kind of forced me to be vulnerable. And otherwise I probably would have tried to hide it. And so sometimes having that visible cue is a really important way to connect. Yeah, last one.
In the top of your talk, I believe you said you were doing work in Seattle. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So I manage a consulting firm. I advise philanthropies, nonprofits, and social impact-focused startups, doing some of that same human-centered design work, that same behavior change work. A lot of the work that I do now is still around health. So one of the projects that I work on is understanding people's relationship with technology and trying to engage with technology in a healthier way, maybe putting the phone down. Just like exercise, that's a lot harder to do than you would think. So driving behavior change in healthcare settings here in the US looks very different than it did in some of those developing world settings, but the same principles apply. And it's been really interesting to explore doing that both with the nonprofit sector here, but also with the private sector, which is more a driver of my work today than it used to be. Yeah.
I hope this isn't a negative question, but I was curious how you deal with people's ignorance about your experiences, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that haven't been to the Middle East and don't know what you've been through.
That's a great question. Thank you. So usually what I say is that people are people everywhere. And I've been really lucky to meet people all over the world. And I find that almost everywhere I go, people like ice cream cones. And they really worry about their kids. Like, that's a common theme. And I was actually talking about this earlier too, but even in these places of tremendous hardship, where there have been conflict for a long time, the vast majority of people are just trying to live their life. And they have the same human needs and urges that we do. They're just as likely to worry about their crushes and like unrequited love as we are, even in the middle of war. And I think it's really important to recognize that, and that there are common themes across all of us, and that they may manifest really differently in places like Sudan or Afghanistan, but people are people. Thanks for that question. One more? Yes.
Is there a certain person or event in your upbringing that triggered this passion for humanitarian work?
Also a good question. I wanted to be an astronaut. Took a wrong turn on that path a while ago. I think the ship might have sailed. You know, I think I've always really liked problem solving, and so I don't know that it was a particular person that inspired that. It's that when I first started out, I was interested in physics, and when our country went to war, first in the Middle East and then in Afghanistan, those problems kept me up at night more so than the physics problems that I was working on. So I was really driven to solve more of those humanitarian problems over the logical, math-focused ones. Although, in retrospect, math usually has an answer, and a lot of these humanitarian crises do not. So it is maybe a tough choice that I made, but a worthwhile one. Great. I think we're at time. Thank you all so much.